Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking the epic historical life of a man whose legacy quite literally shaped the course of history. We're talking about Abraham. We'll be looking at his extraordinary journey, all while exploring the overarching, grand concept of biblical covenants. It's a story of absolutely epic proportions, filled with ancient rituals, profound personal struggles, and a faith that changed the world forever. So get comfortable, focus in, and let's explore how a single life can echo through millennia. I want you to start by just asking yourself this question. What does it truly mean to step into the unknown? I mean, imagine being 75 years old, established, comfortable, and suddenly being told to leave your homeland, your family, your friends, everything you know, to travel to a place you have never even seen. No GPS, no travel itinerary, no safety net. That is exactly the radical departure Abraham made from his home in Haran. It wasn't just a physical journey, it was the ultimate leap into the unknown. Okay, let's dive into this by defining the core driver behind Abraham's journey. As the poet and chaplain Geoffrey A. Studdert Kennedy brilliantly put it, true faith is obeying God regardless of the consequences. This isn't just about sitting back and having positive thoughts. Not at all. This definition is the connective thread behind every single action Abraham takes. He didn't know the destination, but he knew who was leading him, and he chose obedience over comfort time and time again. So, here's our roadmap for today's explainer. First, we'll cover the concept of the covenant. Second, the Genesis 15 promise. Third, the journey of faith. And finally, we'll wrap up with Abraham's legacy. Let's jump right into Section 1, Concept of the Covenant and Understanding the Divine Promises. If we zoom out and look at the macro timeline of biblical history, we see 7 major covenants. And we've got 6 key ones highlighted right here for you. Now, some are conditional, like the Mosaic Covenant, which depended entirely on the Israelites' obedience to the law. But others, they are completely unconditional. We have the foundational promises made to Adam, the global promise to Noah, symbolized by the rainbow. And right there at point 3 is the Abrahamic covenant. This was an unconditional promise of land, descendants, and a global blessing. It didn't depend on Abraham being perfect. It depended entirely on God's faithfulness. And as you'll see, this fits perfectly into the grand historical structure, leading all the way up to the new covenant. Moving on to Section 2, the Genesis 15 promise, or what we can call a vision in the night. Now, this is where high-level theology meets real-life anxiety. It's honestly one of the most striking and mysterious narratives in the text, where God makes a highly specific, binding promise to a very doubting, very human Abraham. And this brilliantly illustrates the sheer scale of what was being promised. Think about it. Abraham is aging, he's childless, and his heir is currently just a servant in his household. He is having a deep, literal, dark night of the soul. But God takes him outside and tells him to look up at the night sky and try to count the stars. God declares that Abraham's descendants will be just as countless. Despite all the biological and logical evidence saying otherwise, the text tells us Abraham believed, and that belief was credited to him as righteousness. It was just a profound moment of internal surrender. But God doesn't just stop at a verbal promise, right? He seals it with an ancient, highly specific ritual. God commands Abraham to bring a 3-year-old cow, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, a dove, and a young pigeon. Abraham takes these animals, cuts the larger ones perfectly in half, and lays the halves opposite each other on the ground. Now, in the ancient world, this was exactly how a binding treaty was formed. The 2 parties would walk between the severed pieces, essentially saying, hey, may this happen to me if I break my word. It sets the stage for a highly dramatic and honestly incredibly eerie scene. Now notice what happens next, because this is absolutely crucial. As the sun sets and thick darkness falls, Abraham falls into a deep, terrifying sleep. Then, a smoking firepot and a flaming torch appear, which symbolize the presence of God, and they pass through the severed animals. But here's the catch. Abraham does not walk through. Only God passes through. This signifies a unilateral covenant. God is taking the entire burden of keeping this promise squarely upon himself. It's a completely one-sided guarantee. No way Abraham could mess it up. But within that same thick darkness, Abraham receives a pretty sobering prophecy. God tells him that before this grand promise of land is actually realized, his descendants will be strangers in a foreign land. They'll be enslaved and mistreated for 400 years. It's a harsh but profound reminder that the life of faith involves a much longer timeline than we often want, and the path to the promise is rarely without intense hardship and waiting.
All right, let's move to Section 3, the journey of faith, and the practical lessons we can pull from it. We are shifting from the grand theology of the burning torch right down to the dirt, the practical, day-to-day, sometimes really messy decisions Abraham had to make to live out this faith. Let's look at a prime example of this by comparing Abraham to his nephew, Lot. When their herds grew too large and their shepherds actually started fighting, they had to separate. Abraham, despite being the elder and holding the divine promise, steps up as the peacemaker. He gives Lot the very first choice of land. Lot measures success by sight and worldly standards. He chooses the fertile, really attractive plains near Sodom. Abraham, walking entirely by faith and seeking eternal values, accepts the secondary, less desirable land. He fully trusted that God's blessing wasn't tied to the best real estate, it was tied to obedience. And while Lot's choices eventually lead him into some severe trouble, he actually becomes a prisoner of war. Now, Abraham could have just crossed his arms and said, "Well, you reap what you sow, Lot." But instead, we see radical grace. Abraham arms his servants, goes into battle, and rescues his totally undeserving nephew. Later on, when God reveals his plan to destroy the wicked city of Sodom, Abraham boldly stands before God, pleading and interceding for the city to be spared. This shows a massive level of spiritual maturity. It's a heart completely aligned with God's mercy, heavily contrasted against Lot's total lack of spiritual depth. But listen, this maturity didn't just happen overnight. It was built through a progression of really severe tests. Step 1 was leaving Haran blindly, stepping way out of his comfort zone. Step 2 was the agonizing wait for the promised son, Isaac, during which Abraham stumbled a bit but ultimately learned to trust God's timing. And Step 3 was the ultimate test on Mount Moriah. God asked Abraham to offer up Isaac, the very son of the promise. What's absolutely fascinating here is that Genesis 22 is the very first time the word love is used in the entire Bible. Take your son, your only son, whom you love. Abraham is willing to give back the very blessing he waited a lifetime for, ultimately proving that the giver was far more important than the gift. Which brings us to our final section, Section 4, Abraham's legacy and building a foundation for the future. A life lived with this kind of radical obedience doesn't just end when the person dies. It creates a rock-solid foundation for the future. Let's look at how his earthly journey concluded and how his impact rippled outward. As the years advanced, Abraham faced the very real pain of loss. His wife Sarah died at the age of 127. Fun fact for you, she's actually the only woman in the entire Bible whose exact lifespan is recorded. Abraham purchased the cave of Machpelah to bury her, and the text specifically notes that he wept bitterly. Those tears were not a lack of faith. They were a profound testament to a deep, lifelong love. They had been partners in this incredibly difficult journey of faith together every step of the way. So, the crucial point of all this is captured beautifully in the book of Hebrews. He was waiting for the city with firm foundations, whose architect and builder is God. Abraham lived to be 175 years old. Before he died, he carefully secured a proper wife for Isaac, totally ensuring the continuation of the covenant. He lived as a temporary resident on earth because his eyes were fixed on an eternal horizon. He walked with God for a full century, transferring the immense spiritual wealth of the covenant down to the next generation. We've seen how Abraham left his home, waited in the dark, and was even willing to give up his most beloved son, all because he trusted the one making the promise. So what does this all mean for us? I leave you with this final provocative thought. What are you willing to give up today to step into a greater promise tomorrow? Remember, true faith is obeying regardless of the consequences. Take a moment today to really reflect on what that means for you. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep seeking, keep learning. I'll see you next time.